Recently, Devin LARRATT went on to the Lion Pride Arm Wrestling podcast, and I really enjoyed watching it, so make sure to go check that out if you have not already. But during this podcast, Devin, of course, ended up giving his prediction for a Gerry Kydyrgali versus Levan Saginashvili match. Now, the last time I talked about this match, I looked at it in the context of Hermes Gasparini versus Levan Saginashvili because, of course, Hermes ended up flop pressing Levan, so I think for a while that was what I was kind of thinking is potentially the closest replica or the closest idea we could get of what that match could potentially look like. Of course, the major problem is, and I talk about this in that video, that Hermes opened in an outside move and forced Levan to combat that in a certain way. And then after he opened in the outside move, he switched to an inside move. So that isn't completely relatable to something that Gerry Kydyrgali would probably do, which is just flop press right off the go. I don't think we're going to see Gerry go outside and then switch to inside. But then I remembered the Euro Arm match in 2016 with Gennady versus Levan. I'd forgotten that Gennady essentially opens this match in a flop press. Now what I would say really happens, because you can see him bringing that shoulder forward and it looks like his hand is supinating. I think what's really going on is that Gennady is trying to force Levan into a hook and Levan just top rolls him. But this is probably the closest thing we could get to at least something that would be comparable to someone opening in a flop press versus Levan. So this just might be the closest thing we could get to a Gerry versus Levan match or what it's going to look like. And this does cause Levan quite a bit of trouble. And this is essentially what Devin says when he's discussing this in this video. Of course, Levan is always going to be the favorites. It's very likely he says that Levan will just maybe low grip Gerry and hook him or even press Gerry's press. Maybe something very similar to what Hermes did versus Gerry. However, Devin does talk about the fact that Gerry's looking really good right now. And potentially, if he can get to a position like this, where he has some sort of isolation on Levan's bicep, he forces Levan to be overpronated. This is where things can get really interesting. Gerry likely does have better endurance than Levan, and he also has the ability to pull in these super awkward positions. He's very, very strong here, and it's not just when he's behind his shoulder. This is something that's super interesting about Gerry. He has that same kind of crazy side pressure even in a position like this. And this is what we saw in the Gennady match. It's what we saw in the Georgi Tsvetkov match. Gerry doesn't only have a press, but he also has this super awkward kind of flop wrist hook thing going on. And so I do think he potentially has the ability to get stops right down next to the pin pad. And this is what we've seen in the Hermes versus Levan matches. Hermes was getting a stop really close to the pin pad. It was when Levan was getting overpronated because there was being up pressure applied underneath or out the back of Levan's hands. So he's getting overpronated. He's losing access to his elbow flexor, or he's losing access to be able to use his bicep, to be able to use his brachioradialis properly to get close to his arm. And he's also losing access to his wrist rise because his own fist is beginning to face his opponent. And when this happens, you generally are going to start losing access to climbing and to side pressure, to back pressure. All of your pressure is going to go down as soon as you get into this overpronated position. And sometimes this is really difficult to avoid. Even if you're trying to supinate in on your opponent, it's really difficult if they can get that bottom meaty part of their palm out the back and push underneath your hand. It can be almost impossible to not get into an overpronated position. So I think this is potentially, this match right here, the 2016 Euro Arm match, is potentially what a Gerry versus Levan match could look like when he does flop press off the go. And you can see this super vertical forearm angle. Levan totally catches it. He's totally in control. But the magic happens when he gets really close to the pin pad, gets overpronated, begins to separate. His fist starts aiming at his opponent. He loses his wrist rise. He gets into this really awkward low hand top roll thing. And eventually, if you guys remember what happens in this match, Gennady starts working. And Gennady is now in the more efficient position because he is using his bone structure. Almost all his bone structure. He's using some elbow flexion, but it's not that much. And Levan is using a lot of elbow flexion. He's using a lot of cupping. And he's using things that are going to gas out. He's using musculature much more so than Gennady Kvyvenya. And every time he hits, he separates himself more, and you can see that his fist is aiming even more so straight forward, which means he's losing his ability to climb. He's losing access to his bicep. He's more so on his brachioradialis, and that is gassing out. But also, he's in this position where he can't get his knuckles up anymore because of his hand position. He's not going to have to use wrist rise to get his knuckles up, but once your fist starts aiming at your opponent, you would actually have to use a wrist extension to get your knuckles to face up and to start to climb, and wrist extension is significantly weaker than wrist or radial deviation, rather. So you basically end up in this awkward position, just like this, where Levan's fist is pointed at Gennady. He has his cup, but he probably doesn't actually want this. He would rather have his knuckles straight up into the air so he could start to climb. But now his anchor point is the kind of knuckle of his wrist, and he's sort of dragging and going sideways. He doesn't have the ability to climb. He doesn't have much of an ability to adjust his position from here. And this is just going to get worse and worse for Levan. He's the one that is in the less efficient position. Even though the position is a lot prettier than Gennady's, he's going to start to gas out. And we can see that as soon as Gennady really finds that access to the elbow flexor, once Levan has gassed himself out a bit, ripped through his own arm, Gennady is able to get this pin. And this is pretty much what it looked like could have happened eventually in the Hermes-Gasparini match. And this is what happened in the Gennady versus Levan match. Now, I know that this is 8 years ago at this point, but the idea is that if both of these guys were natural at this point, maybe this could somehow reflect a super roided out Levan versus a super roided out Jerry Kydyrgali 8 years later. But really, it's just to take a look at what could potentially happen if someone sort of flop presses off the go, because this has actually caused Levan trouble in the past, and I don't think that he's had a match to really kind of prove that there's no issue here anymore. If anything, it seems like the issue is still there. I think a lot of that is just because Levan is so massive, it's going to be difficult for him to get really far inside. So potentially, what I would think probably his best option is against Jerry is to just take a lower grip and prevent Jerry from being able to shove that meaty part of his palm underneath Levan's arm, or underneath his hand, rather. If Levan takes a low grip here, then Gennady cannot get underneath Levan's arm, and this flopping of the wrist will not occur. Levan will not be overpronated because he'll just be forcing the match into a hook, essentially by just dad moving Jerry. And if your opponent is really, really good at hooking, dad moving them is going to be a super big disadvantage for you. But I think that Jerry really is better in that flop press move. And we've seen in the past when Hermes pulled him, if you take a little bit of a lower grip on him and kind of hook him, that's maybe a better way to beat him than trying to top roll him. So I have a feeling that's what Levan will do. Levan also has a really wide hand, so he will be able to get that super low grip, put his bottom two knuckles below the joint of the wrist, and that's going to make it pretty much impossible for Jerry or for anyone to flop underneath Levan. And then from that point, he's just going to be able to curl them in. And once you destroy a flop presser's pronation, then it's going to be really, really difficult for them to have anything. What happens here is that Levan gets overpronated, and because his fist is aiming at Gennady, Gennady actually still has a pretty good deal of pronation. You can see that Levan's wrist is kind of flat in relation to the table. It's kind of parallel in relation to the table, so Gennady actually still has some pronation here. But if Levan had taken a much lower grip and even supinated his own arm and hooked Gennady, then all that pronation would be gone, and he wouldn't have access to isolate Levan's elbow flexor. So all of that being said, it sounds like Devon was pretty much saying the same thing, that if he does something like that, if Levan hooks him, if he presses him, probably it's going to be Levan's day 6-0. He's just so strong, and he has so much cup, and cup can really destroy a flop presser if you are able to take their pronation. But at the end of the day, Jerry is looking really good, and if Jerry can get a position like this, where he is underneath Levan and Levan is overpronated, it only takes one round for that to happen. If Jerry can get that one time, he just might be able to turn everything around, because he does have that X factor, that wild card thing going on where most people just don't have that. You can't beat Jerry in the same way that you can beat most people. You can take almost everything from him, and you could still be the one that's in deep water at the end of the day. So let me know what you guys think about this. Devon did say probably it's going to be 6-0 Levan, but he seems to be giving Jerry quite a bit more of a chance than I might have thought. It seems like he's thinking if Jerry can get just one round in there, then it really might turn everything around. So let me know who you guys think is going to win this match. It's coming up in just about a month at this point. I'm super excited. I do consider Levan, of course, to be the on-paper favorite, but I would really love to see if Jerry could kind of throw everything around and mess up the rankings. I think that would be super awesome. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you later.